In the small village of Mkumbane, nestled in the rolling hills of Uthakila district, KwaZulu-Natal, there was a young man named Sibusiso Dlamini. The red dust of the unpaved roads seemed to coat everything in his world. The modest rondavels, the sparse vegetation struggling against the harsh sun, and the dreams of the young people who yearned for something more. Sibusiso was born into a family where poverty was not just a condition, but a way of life. His father, Mandla Dlamini, was a cattle herder who owned only 3 scrawny cows and a handful of goats. The animals were thin, their ribs showing through patchy coats, much like the family they were meant to sustain. His mother, Mondlovu, rose before dawn each day to tend a small vegetable garden behind their home, then walked 2 kilometers to the local market, where she sold wilted spinach, small tomatoes, and whatever else the unforgiving soil would yield. Life was a constant struggle against hunger and uncertainty. There were nights when the family would share a single bowl of porridge made from the last handful of mealai meal, and mornings when they would start the day with nothing but strong black tea and hope. Yet despite these hardships, Sibusiso's parents never lost their dignity or their faith that their children could rise above their circumstances. Amunta Makafile Jathemba, Mondlovu would often say, her weathered hands stirring the evening meal. A person must live with hope. Sibusiso carried those words in his heart, along with dreams that seemed almost impossible given his circumstances. As he helped his father tend the cattle, watching them graze on the sparse grassland, he would look toward the distant horizon and whisper to himself, Jizafuma Lafan Giafala Impilo Inkono. I will leave this place and live a better life. At 19, with his mother's blessings and his father's silent nod of approval, Sibusiso packed his few belongings into a worn canvas bag and took the early morning taxi to Durban. The city hit him like a wave, the noise, the traffic, the towering buildings that seemed to scrape the sky itself. For the first few nights, he slept in a shelter, sharing a room with a dozen other young men who, like him, had come to the city chasing dreams that glittered like distant stars. He found work wherever he could, loading trucks at the harbor, where the salt air mixed with diesel fumes and sweat, carrying heavy bags of vegetables at the Warwick Junction markets, where the chaos never seemed to end, cleaning office buildings at night when the city finally grew quiet. His hands became rough and calloused, his back ached constantly, but he never complained. Every month, he would send a small portion of his earnings back home to his parents, keeping just enough for rent in a tiny room he shared with 2 other men and basic meals of bread and beans. The rest he saved, coin by coin, note by note, in a small tin hidden under his thin mattress. After 2 years of this grueling routine, Sibusiso had managed to save a modest sum. It was then that his roommate, Jabu, introduced him to a world he had never considered. Buddy, why are you killing yourself with this hard work when there are easier ways to make money? Jabu asked one evening, pulling out a crumpled newspaper with horse racing odds. Just try it once. What's the worst that could happen? Against his better judgment, and perhaps worn down by the endless cycle of backbreaking labor, Sibusiso decided to try betting. He chose numbers that meant something to him: his mother's birth date, the number of cattle his family owned, his own age. To his absolute amazement, he won. Not just a small amount, but enough money to change his life completely. The shock of sudden wealth was overwhelming. For the first time since arriving in Durban, Sibusiso could afford to eat meat, to buy new clothes, to rent a proper room with his own bed. He left his job at the harbor and, with careful planning, began investing in small businesses. A spaza shop in the townships, a small taxi operation, buying and selling goods at the markets. It was at a small restaurant in the heart of the city, a place where the smell of curry and grilled meat mixed with the sounds of Zulu and English conversations, that Sibusiso first saw Ayanda Cube. She moved between the tables with a grace that seemed to defy the weariness in her eyes, her curves accentuated by the simple uniform she wore, her skin smooth as polished bronze. But it wasn't just her beauty that caught Sibusiso's attention. It was something deeper, a sadness that resonated with his own memories of struggle. When she smiled at customers, it never quite reached her eyes, as if she was performing a role rather than living a life. Over several visits to the restaurant, Sibusiso learned Ayanda's story. She was only 22, but had already lived through heartbreak that would have broken many others. She had been a promising student in high school in a small town near Ladysmith, with dreams of becoming a teacher. But at 17, she had fallen pregnant by a boy who disappeared the moment he learned the news. Her family, bound by traditional values and community shame, had forced her to leave school. The baby, a beautiful little girl she named Namsa, became her entire world. But tragedy struck when the child was only 18 months old. A fever that came suddenly and took her away just as quickly, leaving Ayanda with empty arms and a shattered heart. With no education and no family support, Ayanda had drifted to Durban, where she survived by taking whatever work she could find. The restaurant job barely paid enough for rent and food, but it was steady, and in her broken state, steady was all she could manage. When Sibusiso first approached her, she was wary. Too many men had seen her as easy prey, a young woman with no family protection and limited options. But there was something different about this soft-spoken young man with kind eyes and calloused hands that spoke of honest work. Lonan Giina Ofanil Ukamthanda, he whispered to himself the first time she smiled genuinely at him. This is the one I am meant to love. Their courtship was gentle and patient. Sibusiso would come to the restaurant not just for food, but to talk with Ayanda during her breaks. He listened to her stories, shared his own dreams, and slowly, carefully, began to rebuild the trust that life had torn away from her. For Ayanda, who had felt worthless for so long, Sibusiso's attention was like water to a drought-stricken plant. He saw her not as a broken woman with a tragic past, but as someone with untapped potential, someone worthy of love and respect. 3 months into their relationship, Sibusiso made a decision that would define both their futures. He had been watching Ayanda struggle with simple tasks, counting change, reading complicated orders, and realized that her lack of education was holding her back from so much more than just better employment. Ayanda, he said one evening as they walked along the beachfront, the Indian Ocean stretching endlessly before them. What if I told you that you could go back to school? She laughed, but there was no humor in it. Spo, I'm 22 years old. I have no money, no matric certificate, nothing. Those days are behind me. What if they don't have to be? He asked gently. What if I could help you? The conversation that followed changed everything. Sibusiso offered to pay for Ayanda to attend evening classes to complete her matric, and if she succeeded, he would support her through university. It was an offer so generous, so unexpected, that Ayanda initially refused to believe it was real. Why would you do this for me? She asked, tears streaming down her face. Because I love you, Sibusiso replied simply, and because everyone deserves a second chance at their dreams. The next year was a blur of studying and hard work for Ayanda. After her shifts at the restaurant, she would attend classes at a local adult education center, struggling with subjects she hadn't touched in years. Mathematics was particularly challenging, and many nights Sibusiso would find her crying in frustration over homework that seemed impossible. But he never let her give up. He hired tutors when she needed extra help, bought her all the textbooks and supplies she required, and most importantly, provided the emotional support that kept her going when everything seemed too difficult. The night she received her matric results, she had passed with good enough marks to qualify for university, was one of the happiest of both their lives. Jayabanga Spo. Unjisazalm Jempala. Jayakathanda Kakalu, she cried in his arms. Thank you, Spo. You've truly helped me. I love you so much. Minan Jizalala na Q's Kuba Sikugsanini, he whispered back, holding her tight. I will stay with you until the very end. Ayanda enrolled at the University of KwaZulu-Natal in Pietermaritzburg to study education, fulfilling her childhood dream of becoming a teacher. Sibusiso rented a small flat for her near the campus, paid her tuition fees, and provided a monthly allowance for food and books. The distance between Durban and Pietermaritzburg meant they could only see each other on weekends, but their phone conversations were long and filled with Ayanda's excitement about her studies. She was like a different person, confident, articulate, full of plans for the future. Sibusiso had never been happier, knowing that his sacrifices were enabling the woman he loved to become everything she was meant to be. But university life exposed Ayanda to a world she had never known. Her fellow students came from middle-class families, spoke English effortlessly, and took for granted opportunities that seemed magical to her. At first, she felt out of place, too old, too poor, too different from her classmates. It was in this vulnerable state that she met Thabo Masiko. He was a third-year student studying business, the son of a successful businessman from Johannesburg. Thabo was everything Sibusiso was not: polished, educated from birth, comfortable in academic settings, and possessed of the kind of natural confidence that comes from never having known real want. He noticed Ayanda immediately. Her beauty was undeniable, but more than that, there was something intriguing about her maturity, her seriousness about her studies, her difference from the other young women on campus. Tabo's approach was sophisticated and subtle. He offered to help her with assignments, invited her to study groups, introduced her to other students who could help with her coursework. Unlike Sibusiso's earnest, working-class courtship, Tabo's attention came wrapped in the glamour of campus life. Parties at expensive restaurants, weekend trips to game reserves, discussions about literature and politics that made her feel intellectually stimulated in ways she had never experienced. The change in Ayanda was gradual at first. Her weekend visits to Durban became less frequent, her phone calls shorter and less intimate. When Sibusiso asked about her studies, her responses became vague, and when he asked about her new friends, she became defensive. "You wouldn't understand, Spo," she said during one particularly tense phone call. "University life is complicated. I'm meeting people who can help my career." Sibusiso tried to ignore the growing distance between them, telling himself that education was changing Ayanda in positive ways, making her more confident and worldly. But deep in his heart, he sensed something was wrong. The truth came out during the university holidays when Ayanda returned to Durban. She was different. Her clothes were more expensive, her hair styled in a way that must have cost a fortune, her manner of speaking peppered with English phrases that seemed designed to remind him of their different educational levels. One evening, while she was sleeping, Sibusiso noticed her phone buzzing with messages. Without meaning to invade her privacy, he glimpsed the name on the screen, Tabo. The messages that followed, which he read with growing horror, revealed the truth of her betrayal. But it wasn't just an emotional affair. Ayanda had been telling Tabo about Sibusiso's businesses, about the money he had saved, about his generous nature. And Tabo, seeing an opportunity, had convinced her that she deserved better than a man with no education, that she should take what she could from Sibusiso and start a new life with someone more suitable to her new status. The final betrayal came when Sibusiso discovered that Ayanda had forged his signature on bank documents, withdrawing a substantial sum from his business account. The money, nearly everything he had worked so hard to build, was gone, transferred to an account that he later learned belonged to Tabo. When Sibusiso confronted Ayanda with the evidence of her theft, she didn't deny it, but neither did she show remorse. Instead, she seemed to have convinced herself that she was entitled to the money, that it was payment for the years she had wasted with him. "You think you own me because you paid for my education?" she said coldly. "I never asked you to be my savior. I'm with someone now who can give me the life I deserve." The words cut deeper than any physical wound could have. This was not the woman he had loved, not the grateful, warm person who had cried with joy at her matric results. This was someone else entirely, someone hardened by ambition and corrupted by the taste of a lifestyle she had never known. But even in his pain, even with his world collapsing around him, Sibusiso's response came from the deep well of dignity his parents had instilled in him. "Jayakathathelala, Ayanda," he said quietly, his voice steady despite the tears in his eyes. "Kadwa yukumbul, athondo liyinto ebalyokyle. Yuzo labona lokan jelanai alanga." "I forgive you, Ayanda. But remember, love is something sacred. You will realize this one day." With most of his money gone and his trust shattered, Sibusiso's business empire crumbled quickly. His suppliers demanded payment he couldn't make, his employees left for more secure jobs, and within months, he found himself back where he had started, looking for casual labor to survive. But this time, the fall was harder. He was no longer the optimistic young man who had first arrived in Durban with nothing but dreams. Now he carried the weight of betrayal, the knowledge that his love and generosity had been used against him. Meanwhile, Ayanda's new life with Tabo began brilliantly. He introduced her to his family, took her on expensive vacations, and seemed to offer everything Sibusiso could not. For a brief moment, she felt vindicated in her choices, certain that she had traded up from a struggling businessman to a man with real prospects. But Tabo's interest in Ayanda had never been built on love. She had been an exciting diversion, a beautiful woman who offered something different from his usual social circle. Once the novelty wore off, and particularly once the money she had stolen was spent, his attention began to wander. The end came suddenly and cruelly. Tabo simply stopped answering her calls, avoided her on campus, and within weeks was openly dating another woman. This time the daughter of a prominent politician, someone who could actually advance his career and social standing. Ayanda found herself alone in a way that was even more devastating than her earlier struggles. Before meeting Sibusiso, she had been poor but innocent, broken but not corrupted. Now she was educated enough to understand exactly what she had lost, sophisticated enough to recognize the emptiness of the world she had chosen, but with no way back to the love she had destroyed. Without Tabo's support, Ayanda couldn't afford to complete her degree. She dropped out of university just months before graduation and returned to Durban, but the city no longer felt like home. The restaurant where she had worked wouldn't take her back. The owner had heard about her treatment of Sibusiso and wanted nothing to do with her. She found work where she could, but her years at university had made her unsuitable for the menial jobs that were available, while her lack of a degree prevented her from accessing better opportunities. The gap between her educated aspirations and her limited options created a frustration that ate at her daily. It was in this state of desperation that Ayanda began making increasingly poor choices. She started drinking heavily, seeking temporary escape from the reality of her situation. She became involved with a series of men who promised her things they never delivered, each relationship leaving her more cynical and broken than the last. The drinking led to harder substances, and soon Ayanda was caught in a downward spiral that accelerated beyond her control. Her beauty, which had once been her greatest asset, began to fade under the toll of addiction and despair. Friends from her university days, the ones who had seemed so important, disappeared entirely once it became clear she had nothing to offer them. The sophisticated world she had thought she was joining revealed itself to be built on superficial connections that evaporated the moment she was no longer useful or entertaining. 2 years after the betrayal, Ayanda contracted a serious illness. Her weakened immune system, compromised by years of poor choices, couldn't fight off what should have been a treatable condition. She died in a public hospital, alone except for a social worker who stayed with her during her final hours. Word of her death reached Sibusiso through mutual acquaintances. Despite everything that had happened between them, despite the pain she had caused him, he felt only sadness at the news. He attended her funeral, standing at the back of the small crowd gathered at the cemetery in her home township. Looking around at the sparse gathering, a few relatives who had reluctantly come, some former colleagues from the restaurant, a handful of people whose connection to Ayanda was unclear, Sibusiso realized how completely she had isolated herself from everyone who had ever genuinely cared about her. As dirt was thrown onto the simple wooden coffin, Sibusiso whispered a final goodbye. Ngangingathanda kuba sekufalini, kadwa ukufala kuzafindisa. Ukathanda amuntu akusho akuthi uzozalisa. Lalan go kuthila Ayanda. I would have loved you until the end, but life teaches us lessons. Loving someone doesn't mean you should diminish yourself. Rest in peace, Ayanda. Years later, Sibusiso slowly rebuilt his life, though he never again achieved the same level of financial success he had once known. More importantly, he never again loved with the same innocent trust he had given Ayanda. The experience had taught him that love, no matter how pure, cannot save someone who doesn't want to be saved, and that generosity without wisdom can become a form of self-destruction. He eventually married a kind woman from his home village, someone who understood the value of hard work and simple happiness. They built a modest but contented life together, raising children who learned from their father's story the difference between love that builds and love that destroys. The tale of Sibusiso and Ayanda became one of those stories told in the villages and townships, a cautionary tale about the price of betrayal and the danger of abandoning those who love us for the promise of something better. But it was also a story about forgiveness, about maintaining dignity in the face of betrayal, and about the truth that love, real love, never seeks to possess or diminish, but always seeks to lift up and set free. In the end, both Sibusiso and Ayanda paid a price for their love. He lost his fortune and his innocence. She lost her life and her soul. But only one of them learned the lesson that love, true love, is indeed something sacred, worth protecting even when it costs us everything we thought we wanted.